Today we're going to learn Pesachim Daf Ayin Zayin. It's the Daf for Shabbat. Today's Daf is dedicated by Elisheva Gray. With much gratitude and appreciation to everyone at Hadran. I feel truly blessed to have discovered Hadran at the time I decided to take on Daf Yomi and to have such a skilled and dedicated Morah leading us all on this wonderful journey through Talmud, as well as the supporting teachers and resources available on the Hadran website. A heartfelt Todah Rabah to all. With that, we're going to get started with our Daf. We saw in the previous daf, the Mishnah, okay, there's 5 sacrifices that are brought betuma, meaning if people are tameh, you're allowed, if let's say the meat became impure, you're allowed to bring the sacrifice anyway, but not ne'echalim betuma, meaning if the meat became tameh and you haven't sprinkled the blood yet, you could still sprinkle the blood. Ha'omer, what are the 5? Ha'omer, but you're not allowed to eat the meat. That's what's unique about these 5. You can bring them, but you can't eat the meat. So we talked about them, the Omer, the Shei Lechem, the Lechem Apanim, the Zivchei Shalmei Tzibor, and the Sirei Rashi Chodeshim. As opposed to the Pesach, which can even be eaten betuma. So then the Gemara had tried to say, why? Chamisha le'mi'utei mai, what are the 5 coming to exclude? The mi'utei chagigat chamisha asal, right? So they said it's to exclude the chagiga. You might have thought that since it's a korban tzibor and it has a specific time, maybe tumah would override it, even if the meat became tameh. Kamash malan, no, comes to teach you what's the reason. Because you can make it up all 7 days of the holiday, therefore it doesn't override tumah. So here they say, it doesn't override Shabbat. Since it doesn't override Shabbat, it also doesn't override Tumah. So then they say, so why don't they mention here the siirim that you bring on the regal? There's the sirezim you bring lechatat on the regalim. So why don't they say that? They say, in fact, they do say it. Where did they say that? It wasn't listed. Oh, when it's talked about the zivchei shalmei tzibur, that we thought when we learned the Mishnah, we're referring to the ones that you bring on Shavuot. No, it actually is referring to the Sirei. Well, then something doesn't make sense. Why did it mention the Sirezim that you bring? By the way, you bring these because maybe there was accidental tumah sometime and they atone for that. So they say, so why does Sirei Rosh Chodeshim mentioned separately? Why don't you just say the Sirei Chatat that go for holidays and Rosh Chodesh, right? The first day of every month of the month. So they say, right, so why do you need them? So they say, no, even if you had Sirei of the holidays, you still wouldn't necessarily know the Sirei of the Rosh Chodeshim. Why is that? You might have thought it doesn't say Moed by Rosh Chodesh. So you might have thought it's not a holiday. And all the others, remember we learned the whole issue that things override Shabbat is because it says Moed. That's what we were trying to say. Since they override Shabbat, they also, right, you can therefore bring them betuma. So they say, maybe you would have thought, Kid Abaye, Damar Abaye, Tamuz Dahai Shata, Milave Miluye Milua, Dirtiv Karala Moed Lishbor Bachurai. There's a whole bunch of different things that we need to learn to understand this line. We'll start from the end. The pasuk they quote is from Eicha. That's a pasuk lamenting the destruction of the temple. Now there's a connection they make, the Gemara in Ta'anit, Daf Kaftet, makes a connection between the night, it's very famous Rashi on the Torah, the night that the Jews cried for Cheder Meraglim was Tisha B'Av, and they ended up getting punished, right? God said, you cry now, I'll give you a crying for generations. So now, Abaye says, in Kara Lai Moed L'Shbor B'Churai is a verse from Eicha lamenting the destruction, which connects Tisha B'Av, right, to the Meraglim. And the Meraglim that year, it really, okay, there's a whole calculation they do in Ta'anit. We'll deal with it when we get there. But they discuss that it was the 29th of, how's it work? It was the 29th of Tammuz, the day that the Meraglim were sent, right? The 40 days comes out in Av because it was the 29th day. I don't know why it's eluding me. Nisan or Sivan. It was the 29th day of Sivan. Okay, there's a whole calculation they do there. And from there, 40 days later, comes out on Tisha B'Av. But it's only going to come out on Tisha B'Av if Tammuz that year, which is normally missing a day, meaning chaser, it means it was a 29-day month, actually was a 30-day month that year. And they learned that from this verse, Kara Lai Moed. They called me a holiday, meaning they made Rosh Chodesh a day later, okay? So the idea being is that Rosh Chodesh is called Moed, and you learn it from that verse. So it's to teach you. You might have not thought so. Comes this to teach you that it is. Okay, next. Wait, does it all come? This seems to imply that it all is learned out, as I said before, from the word Moed. So where do we get this from? So now we're going to see where they learned that all these things override Shabbat and therefore also Tumah. Ditanu Rabbanit, the rabbis learned, again, opening to a Braita. So this is a pasuk about the holidays. Why does it say that? So now they say, okay, we learned from the word Pesach and Shabbat Moado. We saw those verses in the past. Those come to teach you that they override Shabbat. Since they override Shabbat, they also override Tumah, meaning if people are Tameh or if the meat becomes Tameh, you bring them anyway. Where do we get all other communal offerings? These are the things you should do for God on their designated times. This is a pasuk. It's found in Bamidbar, Parak Kaftet, which is all about the list of the sacrifices. So there it says you're supposed to do these in their appropriate times. That means they override Shabbat. But but in that list of korbanot there, it talks about the sacrifices that you bring for the holidays, but it doesn't mention the shtei alechem, and it doesn't mention the korban omer. Those appear in Vayikra, Parakaf Gimel, in Parshat Emor. And there it doesn't say, do these b'moadechem. So they say, Talmud Lomar, and that's the verse we started with. That's why we learn it from this verse, which is a verse from Emor. Vayidaber Moshe et moadei Hashem al bnei Yisrael. Moshe told the people, the Moadim, all the holidays, and the holidays are called Moadim. Here you see the same word that's used everywhere else. And there the Shtei Alechem is mentioned, and there the right, which is the special sacrifice on Shavuot, and also the what we're talking about, the Shtei Alechem and the Omer, the Korban Omer, the Omer sacrifice that they brought, right, which was the Mincha offering. Those are mentioned there. Okay, so from there, Hakatuv Kava'o Mo'ed Echad L'Kulam. The Torah gave them each, right, their own date, meaning that, but it's one Mo'ed for all, meaning that they all override Shabbat and Tumah. Now we're going to have a classic Gemara. Why do you need all of these? Okay, there's a chart for today. I don't always get to make a chart on Shabbat, but there's one for today that'll be very useful. Also, just to figure out where the Gemara is going. Later, the conversation is going to get a little complicated. Here you can follow in the chart. It'll be helpful. So we're going to have a classic tzriche. Why did you need a special drasha for Tamid, for Pesach, for the other holidays, for the Omer and the Shtei Alechem? Why couldn't we just have learned one from the other? And for Rosh Chodesh, right? Oh, no, we don't have Rosh Chodesh. Okay. So now where are we going to learn this from? Tzriche. This is our classic. If we just had the Korban Tamid, you say, well, the Korban Tamid is more stringent because all of it gets burnt and it's very common. You do it every single day. So all the more reason it would override Shabbat. Aval Pesach lo, but maybe not Pesach, and obviously not all the rest. Kam mashmalan. Okay, therefore it comes to teach you also Pesach. Now, once we have Pesach, let's say the Torah just said it by Pesach. Why wouldn't we have learned from there to everywhere else? So you might have thought Pesach shuanush karet. Classic, we keep going back. Pesach is very severe. If you don't do the Korban Pesach, you get karet. So because of that, you might have thought we're going to be more strict. Aval tamid de'en anush karet emalo, but maybe you wouldn't say the same thing for the Korban Tamid, and obviously all the others. Let's say you have both of those. So maybe from there you could say, well, it's not that and it's not that. Maybe the combination of the two would be able to teach for everything else. But then you'd say no. Havamina hanihu yesh behem tzad chamor. Right? These hanihu yesh behem tzad chamor. These two have a stringency about them. Tamid tadir v'kalil pesach shuanush karet. Right? Each has the one that we just mentioned. Aval shar korbanot tzibur emalo. But maybe you'd say all the other public the public offerings, no, they don't have these chumrot. So maybe it's because they're not stringent like all the others. Maybe you'd say, they don't need it. Therefore, that's why it has a verse specifically by the holidays. If you had just that, maybe you could learn it from there to everything else. So not really, because what do we say? If you had it by the other sacrifices and Pesach and Shabbat, you know for all those, but you wouldn't necessarily know for the Omer and Shtei Alechem. Why? Omer and Shtei Alechem are different. Why are they different? The Omer and the Shtei Alechem don't come to atone for anything. They don't come because it's this, right? They come to allow, to be what we call a matir. It permits something. Okay, the Omer permits the new wheat, and the Shtei Alechem, which you bring on Shavuot, right at the end of the period of the Omer, allows you to use the new wheat in sacrifices, in anything in the temple. Before that, you can't use new wheat in the temple until you bring the Shtei Alechem. So let's say you make a meal offering, it has to be made from the old wheat until you do the Shtei Alechem. So each are only lahatir ba'alma. They're not coming to atone for anything, they're coming to permit something. So therefore, you might have thought those wouldn't be included. So now the obvious classic, since we said, well, this one is the least likely, why don't we just start with that one? And if those are the least likely, the Omer and the Shtei Alechem, then that they'll override Shabbat. Then why don't we say, let's learn it. The Torah could have told it just there, and then we know everything else. So now they're going to take the same logic we just used a minute ago and flip it. Let's say it just said it by them. You would have thought maybe the reverse of what we just said. Maybe those are very strong because they actually permit something. They do much more than everything else. But maybe the others not. Kamash malan. That's why you need all of them to teach you that each one overrides Shabbat and each one from its own separate drasha. Okay, now starts a whole new section about, since we're talking in the Mishnah about these could be brought bituma, we're now going to talk about this concept of tuma hutra b'tzibur. Now, until now, we generally use this term to mean tum'ah is permitted in the tzibur. Tzibur usually means in the community, meaning if the majority of the people want to bring the korban pesach and they're tmeim, or the majority of the kohanim are tmeim, we allow it to be brought anyway b'tumah. But now we're using it in a bit of a different way. And this is if the meat becomes tameh while we're doing a communal sacrifice, we're going to allow that sacrifice to continue, to keep bringing it. Okay, so that's what we're going to say now. So, savrua tilakuli alma tuma dechuya hi b'tzibur ubayet sitz leratzot. So the first thing they're going to say is everybody agrees. They thought, okay, this is what they're assuming, that everyone agrees that tuma is dechuya b'tzibur. That means that if there's tuma, then we're going to basically allow this, if there's tuma for a tzibur, for a communal offering, we're going to allow it to be sacrificed, but it's dechuya. Dechuya there's a difference between hutra and dechuya. Hutra means it's permitted entirely, as if we don't care anymore. Once the meat is tameh, so people can eat it b'tumah, there's no issue of tumah. Dechuya means it's just pushed aside, which means it's still there. We're going to allow the animal to be sacrificed or the blood to be put on the mizbeach, but it's only pushed off. So we'll see. What does that mean? Ubayet tzitz leratzot. The tzitz is this head plate that the Kohen Gadol wore that said Kodesh LaHashem, and it had the Yud Kei Vav Kei, the special name of God on it. And the Kohen Gadol, there's a debate about whether he has to wear it or doesn't have to wear it. We'll see that later. But when he was wearing it, or maybe even if he wasn't wearing it, it was just there, that provides atonement for something that was brought b'tumah. Anything that really was brought b'tumah is provided with atonement with the tzitz, although depending on certain circumstances. So what they're saying is, if we say tumah is dechuya, that means we still need atonement for it. So the tzitz is meratzeh. So the tzitz provides the atonement that we need for the fact that we had to do it b'tumah. So again, even though it's allowed because it's tameh, we need some atonement here because the tumah is still there. It's not like it's totally wiped out and ignored. Because there's no one, it's very funny they're saying this, there's no one except for Rabbi Yehuda. That means basically There is someone, but it's only one minor opinion of Rabbi Yehuda who thinks the Tumah is Hutra. If you say Tumah is Hutra, then you don't need the tzitz. So now the Gemara says, how do we know that Rabbi Yehuda is the only one? Tanya, as it says in the Braita, tzitz ben sheyeshno al mitzcho uben she'eno al mitzcho miratzeh. The tzitz, whether he was wearing it, here's the machloket I just mentioned, or if he wasn't wearing it, it's miratzeh, divrei Rabbi Shimon. So the Kohen Gadol doesn't need to be wearing it. It provides a atonement anyway. Rabbi Yehuda omer, odeo al mitzcho miratzeh, ein odeo al mitzcho eno miratzeh. Only if it's on the Kohen Gadol does it work. This doesn't yet relate to our issue. We'll see in a minute. So in the conversation the two of them had, Amar lo Rabbi Shimon, Kohen Gadol b'Yom Kippurim yochiach. I'll prove to you, if on Yom Kippurim something became tamei, or someone became tamei, or something was done in an impure way in the Beit HaMikdash, the Kohen Gadol in Yom Kippurim has special clothes. He doesn't wear his regular clothes. So then, Eino al mitzcho, when he wears the big day Lavan, he's not wearing his regular clothes. He has special white clothing he wears. And it says there, now, Kohen Gadol b'Yom Kippurim yochiach she'eino al mitzcho meratzeh. Now we know that the tzitz works also in Yom Kippur. So if that's the case, how could it work also in Yom Kippur if the Kohen Gadol's not wearing it? So Amar lo, Rabbi Yehuda says to him, Hanach liyom kippurim shetumah hutra b'tzibur. You don't need the tzitz to be meratzeh, because what are you doing on Yom Kippurim? You're only doing communal offerings. There's no individual offerings on Yom Kippur. So you don't need the tzitz to be meratzeh because tumah hutra b'tzibur, exactly what we said. So now that was all to prove that Rabbi Yehuda is the only one who thinks this. Okay, and therefore the Gemara says nobody else thinks this other than Rabbi Yehuda. So we're going to assume that tumah is dechuya b'tzibur and the tzitz is meratzeh on the tumah. Okay, we'll see where this takes us. Udikuleama, the second thing. Okay, right now they're just establishing two basic principles. The first we just said, tumah is dechuya and therefore needs the tzitz. Number two, dikuleama eina tzitz meratzeh al achilot. Now again, we're going to say the same thing. Everybody agrees, even though we're going to show that somebody disagrees. Everyone agrees that the tzitz does not provide atonement on eating. That means if we brought this sacrifice because someone was tamei, but it got brought anyway, so the tzitz provides us with atonement, and we can sprinkle the blood on the altar, but you cannot eat the meat, okay? It's not. How do we know this? Delei katanat deshamatle de'amar hatzitz meratzeh al achilot ela Rabbi Eliezer. The only one who says that the tzitz is meratzeh on achilot is Rabbi Eliezer. Nobody else agrees with him. Tanya, how do we know this? Rabbi Eliezer omer hatzitz meratzeh al achilot. Rabbi Yossi omer ein hatzitz meratzeh al achilot. Interesting, by the way, that in both these sources, it's one person against one person. It's not the majority versus one. But yet they claim that this person they want to tell you is in the minority. Everyone else disagrees with them. So Rabbi Eliezer is the one who says it works, and therefore you can eat the meat. But Rabbi Yossi says, no, you can't. So now, these are two ideas. Again, let's just review. Tumah dechuya b'tzibur, and therefore, since it's only pushed aside, but it's not overridden entirely as if it doesn't exist, you need the tzitz. Number two, that builds on this, then you can't eat the meat because the tzitz is only meratzeh on for the sprinkling of the blood, but not to permit you to eat the meat. So now, based on that, nema matnitin de lo ke Rabbi Yeshua. Then we're going to say, it seems, or there's a question, are we going to say our Mishnah doesn't follow Rabbi Yeshua? How do we get here? We didn't see Rabbi Yeshua yet. Tanya, we're going to have a big famous big machloka between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Eliezer about the blood and the dam, and what if something happens to the meat? Can you sprinkle the blood? What if something happens to the blood? Can you eat the meat? So Rabbi Yeshua omer, im ein dam, ein basal. Im ein basal, ein dam. If you don't have blood, then you can't eat the meat. And meaning, if the blood spills, let's say, or the blood becomes impure, then you can't eat the meat. Im ein basal, ein dam. And likewise, if you don't have the meat, then you can't sprinkle the blood. The meat becomes tamei, you can't sprinkle the blood. Rabbi Eliezer omer, dam af al pi she'ein basal. Okay, Rabbi Eliezer says, blood, even if you don't have meat, you can sprinkle the blood, even if the meat becomes impure. Doesn't matter. Shneimar, how do we know this? Okay, and they're going to darshan this pasuk. I even brought the whole pasuk on your sheet, starting on the second side of the first sheet, page number 2. So it's the pasuk is from Devarim Perek Yubet pasuk Kasayim. V'asita olotecha haba. I put it specifically on 2 lines so that you could see. Asita olotecha habasar v'hadam al mizbach Hashem Elokecha. We're now going to have a ping pong back and forth. Who learns what from where? We started with saying, are we going to say our Mishnah is like not like Rabbi Yeshua? It's going to take us a long time till we get to the connection. So hold off. So it says you should do your sacrifices, the basar and the dam, the meat and the blood, on the mizbeach, on the altar of God. V'dam zvafchecha yishafech al mizbach Hashem Elokecha, and the blood of your sacrifices should be spilled on the altar. V'habasar tochal, and the basar should be eaten. Okay, so now how are we going to darshan this? The first thing we say, we started off with asita olotecha basar v'adam. So Rabbi Yeshua says from there, ein basar, ein dam, ein basar, because asita olotecha basar v'adam is if they're both together. Rabbi Eliezer says, no, you just need blood. Why? Because it says, v'dam zvachecha yishafech. So what do they say? Umani mekayem v'asita olotecha basar v'adam. What do you do with that, Rabbi Eliezer? Say, lomar lecha, ma dam b'zrika, af basar b'zrika. Just like dam gets thrown on the altar, likewise the meat gets thrown on the altar. He says that comes to teach a totally different halacha, which has nothing to do with anything that we're talking about. And what do we learn from here? Havei omer, lul katan haya ben kevesh lemizbeach. We saw this before. At some point we learned this. There's a space between the ramp going up to the altar and the altar. And when they put the meat, when they wanted to burn it on the altar, they would throw it because they would try to get over that ramp. They would throw it. That's how you learn the meat has to be thrown also, just like the blood. That's what he learns from basar v'hadam. Rabbi Yeshua, nami haktiv v'dam zvachecha yishafech. If it's really the blood can be done without the meat. So look, that's where Rabbi Eliezer proved it from. Look, Rabbi Yeshua, it says v'dam zvachecha yishafech. That's his proof. What do you do with that? Amar lecha haktiv gabe v'habasar tochel. Sister, what do you mean you're proving it from the second part? The second part of the verse also mentions the meat. It says, spill the blood, and then it says, and then you can eat the meat. That means, again, they're intertwined. So Rabbi Eliezer didn't think so, but Rabbi Yeshua says they're clearly intertwined. You can't have one without the other. So soon we'll get back to what does Rabbi Eliezer do with that. But now we're going to say, according to Rabbi Yeshua, what he's basically saying is then, dam zvachecha yishafech v'basar yechel, and the beginning part of the pasuk, asita lotecha habasar v'hadam, both are coming to teach the same thing. They're both coming to teach Imein basal, ein dam, imein dam, ein basal. Why do you need two parts of the same pasuk to teach you the same thing? So they say, right? What do you need both verses for? One is to teach you for a korban olah, a burnt offering, and one is to teach you for a peace offering. Now again, like we saw before, it's a tzricha. Why do you need it in both places? You would say maybe only by the olah you have to have both the meat and the blood, because the olah is very stringent because we burn it all on the altar. But the shlamim isn't so stringent, therefore maybe not. Let's say it just said peace offerings. Now, generally peace offerings are much more lenient than olah, so how are you going to explain this one? So they say, maybe we could say the reverse logic. Shlamim is more severe in this case specifically because it has two achilot. Now we're going to learn the word achila, and this makes our sugya a little bit complicated. Till now we meant achila meant the eating of the meat. But we're going to learn that achila also refers to the eating of the meat on the altar. What does that mean? The burning of it. In a shlamim, what happens? Some of the meat gets burnt on the altar. Some of the meat gets eaten. For our purposes, since we're talking about the meat and the blood and whether the meat is important, you might say, look, there's two types of achilot that happen in this kind of sacrifice. There's the eating on the altar of the parts that get burnt, and there's the eating of the owners of the meat. That might make it that in the shlamim, we're going to be more strict. And if you lose the meat, maybe it's a problem where the meat becomes tameh. Maybe you can't sprinkle the blood. And therefore, right? You might have thought, aval ola delay pashtei achilot emalo, but maybe we're not going to be as strict with the korban olah. Kamashmalan. That's why we need it in both places. Okay. We're still right now. All we're trying to do is understand Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Eliezer and where they get it from the verses. So Rabbi Eliezer nami hakti v'abasar tochal. Now remember, Rabbi Yeshua said you tried to prove him dam zvachecha yishafech, but it says also there, and you eat the meat. So that clearly means you need both. So Rabbi Eliezer says you only need the blood because of dam zvachecha yishafech. What's he going to do with habasar tochel? Amar Lacha, he'll say to you, it's coming to tell you that the basar is not permitted until you sprinkle the blood. So if that's the case, maybe the whole thing is coming, right? Maybe the whole pasuk is just coming to tell you that you can't eat the meat until you sprinkle the blood, meaning, right, it's chronological. And maybe the whole verse is coming to teach you that, right? When it said, asito lotecha basar v'adam, and then it tells you, dam svachecha, and then basar yachel, maybe it's coming to teach you the order in which you do things. Yes, you have to bring the basar and the dam, and the dam comes first, and only after can you eat the meat, right? We know this. You can only eat the meat once you already finish your sacrifice, which is the blood. So they say, why don't you just say the whole pasuk is coming to teach you that? So they say, dam apapi she'ein sham basar minalan. So how do we know that the blood, now we're in Rabbi Eliezer, right? How do we know that that we learn from this verse, the dam, even when there's no basal? Amar lacha, im ken nichtav rachmana habasar tochal, v'hadar dam zvachecha yishafech, ki dichtiv bereisha. They're now pointing out something about the order of the verse. Notice in the beginning it said, asita olotecha habasal v'hadam. The meat came first. So if the second part was coming to teach you the same thing as the first, it was all coming with the same idea, it would have had it in the same order. It would say, and you eat the meat, as long as you already sprinkled the blood. So therefore, right, as it says in the Reisha, so why did it say first dam zvachecha? It comes to teach you that you can do the blood even if the meat is no longer valid or gone or whatever it might be. And you can learn from here the other thing we saw before, which is basar mutar b'achila ad shizarei kadam. So you can actually learn two things from there, that you can only eat the meat once you've already sprinkled the blood. In other words, again, it means you don't need the meat to sprinkle the blood, but if you have the meat, you can only eat it once you've already done sprinkling the blood. Now we're back to Rabbi Yoshua. Rabbi Yoshua, ein basar mutar b'achila ad shizarei kadam. Well, now we're stuck with, again, the ping pong. That halacha that Rabbi Eliezer just learned from dam zvachecha yishapech basar yachel. What did Rabbi Yoshua learn from there? He learned from there that you need im ein dam ein basar, right? And then he learned dam zvachecha yishapech. He said, right. He said it's to teach you im ein dam ein basar ein dam. Just one was for the shlamim, one was for the ola. So he learned from there that it's the opposite, right? The other halacha, which means it's not free to teach you that the basar is not permitted ad shizarei kadam. So where does he learn that from? He says you don't need a drasha for that. It's a kal v'chomer. What's the kal v'chomer? Ma'imurim dechilitnehu lo ma'akve. Let's talk about the parts that get burnt on the altar. Let's say they get lost. So what do we learn? There's 4 main avodot that you're supposed to do in the rituals. One is, right, shchita, kabbalah, holacha, zrika, right? Slaughtering, catching the blood, walking it to the altar, and sprinkling it on the altar. Notice what's not part of them. Burning the parts on the altar. You do that later, after you sprinkle the blood. That's what we're going to learn right now, right? That's the whole point. So now they're going to say, right, before we were talking about eating the meat, but now we're using the example of burning. The imurim, if you lose them, lo ma'akve, since it's not part of the main part of the avodah, it doesn't prevent your korban from going through. You can bring your korban anyway. But ki itnihu ma'akve, but if they're there, then they have to be burned. Okay? So now, dam dechilete ma'akev. If you don't have the blood, if it's not there, it is ma'akev. It prevents your korban from going through. But ki ite, so when you have them, lo koshken de ma'akev. Okay, what they mean here, sorry, I forgot to explain. When we talked about the imurim, again, let's put it this way. There's 3 things that have to happen. 1 is the blood gets sprinkled. 2 is the parts get burnt on the altar. And 3 is you can eat the meat. Now, the imurim, what's the order? The order is sprinkle the blood, burn them on the altar, and then you can eat the meat. You can't eat the meat until you burn the parts on the altar. So that's the first part. The imurim, if they get lost, then it's fine. If something happens to them and they get lost, you're allowed to eat your meat. But if they're there, then they prevent you from eating your meat. You can't eat your meat until you've you've burnt those imurim. So the blood, if you lose the blood, that prevents you from finishing your korban. Remember, the blood is the most important part of your sacrifice. But when they're in existence, they're there. The blood, of course, it prevents you from doing the imurim, and of course, it prevents you from eating. So therefore, he says it's very obvious then, if you haven't done the blood, obviously you're not going to be able to eat. And that you don't need a verse to teach you. So what's Rabbi Eliezer going to say to that? Sometimes the Torah teaches you something that you could have learned by a kal v'chomer, but they teach you anyway. And Rabbi Yeshua, why doesn't he hold by that? He has a different approach. Right? In other words, you don't need, right? They don't, if there's a way to do the drasha, you do the drasha. You don't need a drasha if you already have it from a kal v'chomer. So hashtalema matnitin deloka Rabbi Yeshua. Okay, now we get back to why we brought this in the first place. You probably can't even remember where we started. So I'll remind you, where did we start? We had two halachot. One is Kule Alma, right? Everyone holds, other than one opinion, that Tuma is dechuya and you need the tzitz, meaning when we bring a korban betuma, which is the topic of our Mishnah, it's just pushed off, but you need the tzitz to provide atonement. And the second was that tzitz provides atonement, right? But not to allow you to eat the meat. Okay, now, then we showed Rabbi Yeshua. What does Rabbi Yeshua say? If there's no blood, there's no meat. If there's no meat, there's no blood. So now let's read what they're going to do with this. Lema manitin deloka Rabbi Yeshua. Let us say now, or it seems like, or should we say, that the Mishnah is not like Rabbi Yeshua. Why? Dekevan de amar b'inan tarte. Since we're bringing this betuma, and what did we say when you bring something betuma, right? Sitz a'achilot lo meratze. Right, you need two things, and the tzitz, right? You need the dam and the basal. Okay, according to Rabbi Yeshua, you need both the blood and the meat. Now, the tzitz achilo lo miratzeh. Now, the tzitz, what does it provide atonement for? That if you sprinkle the blood, it's fine, but it doesn't atone for the eating of the meat. So you're in a case right now where you don't have meat if you say tuma dechuya. And according to Rabbi Yeshua, if you don't have meat, you can't sprinkle the blood. So hechiate betuma. Right? So how can you possibly bring the sacrifice betuma? So the Mishnah must not be like Rabbi Yeshua. Okay? That's what the Gemara questions, or kind of states it, but as a kind of question. Could it be our Mishnah doesn't match Rabbi Yeshua? So now we're going to have 4 attempts to answer this question. Okay? So the first one, afilu tema Rabbi Yeshua. Really, we can say our Mishnah is Rabbi Yeshua. How so? Ela kasaval Rabbi Yeshua tzitz meratzeh al ha'olin. I said before that achila really means 2 things. It means eating it on the altar, meaning burning it on the altar, and eating it, food, physically eating it. So what he says is that tzitz is meratza on the first type. The tzitz allows you to burn items on the altar. It just doesn't allow you to physically eat them. The part of the meat that you can eat, no, you can't eat that, but you can put them on the altar. So therefore, that will explain why. So then you have basar, because yesh basar. You can put these, burn them on the altar. So that works perfectly fine if you say that. So then, yesh dam and yesh basal, and Rabbi Yeshua would say it's fine when it's brought betuma. So, because again, the tzitz is meratzeh, and if the tzitz is meratzeh, that will cover, right, your blood and the meat that gets burnt. And that's great because then you have meat. But they say there's a bit of a problem. That only works for some of the cases in the Mishnah. Hatinach zvachim, it works for the zvachim, the sacrifices. Di'ika olin, because there's something that gets burnt on the altar. But Ella Omer Shtei Alechem delay Ka'olim. But the Omer and Shtei Alechem, there is nothing that gets burnt on the altar. So what are you going to do there? The Omer, right? It's a mincha offering. So actually, there is something that gets burnt, but it's a whole debate. They say the kmitza and the burning is like the zrikat adam, and then because they don't have zrikat adam, and then the eating the leftovers is what we compare to burning on the altar. So they don't actually, and the Shtei Alechem doesn't get burnt at all on the altar. So you just eat it. So there's no aspect there. So if we say that, ma'ika lememar, what are you going to say? In that case, im ein dam, ein basal, or im basal, ein dam. So it means you can do, right, one stage. You can't do it if you can't eat it. And neither of these can be eaten because there is no eating on the altar. So there's nothing that can be eaten. So because they're tameh and the tzitz is not meratz, it doesn't allow you to eat the Shtei Alechem and doesn't allow you to eat the korban omer, the shirayim, the leftover parts that don't get burnt. So Amre ki Am Rabbi Yeshua nami debinan tarte, debinan tarte bizvachim b'menachot lo amar. maybe when he said im ein dam, ein basar, and ein basar, ein dam, that was only about the sacrifices, but not about the comparable situation in menachot. Okay, so that's our answer. But what's the problem? Right now, we're still within all the first answer. To try to say that our Mishnah could be Rabbi Yeshua, and it's true, he says the tzitz is meratza on ochlim, but it is meratza on things that go on the altar. So now they say, Ube menachot lo amar. Wait, he didn't say when it comes to menachot that im ein basar ein dam. Of course he did. Let's see. It's again, even though there's no blood and there's no meat, but it's whatever would compare. The ilu haitana savar. Sorry, I lost it. He didn't say it by menachot, but hatana, and it says in the Mishnah, nitmeu shiareha, avdu shiareha. Okay, what if nitmeu? They actually in the Girsa it says also nisrifu, which you'll see from later on the Gemara. It seems like it is there. If the extra part, right? This is again, you burn part and you're left with the leftovers. This is the korban omer, the mincha. If the leftovers became impure, or they got burnt, or they got lost, what do you do? Kimidat Rabbi Eliezer kshera. Okay, Rabbi Eliezer says no problem, because again, ein dam, ein basar, it doesn't matter, right? You only need, right? The dam can be brought even without the meat. But Kimidat Rabbi Yoshua, who says in ein basar, ein dam, or in ein dam, ein basar, you need both. It's psula, because you don't have the leftovers anymore, and that's the comparison to the meat. So how do we answer this? Well, kimidat velo kimidat. We could say it's sort of like Rabbi Yoshua, but not fully like Rabbi Yoshua. That's a weird answer. We'll see in a minute. They're going to reject. But right now, explain what do we mean? Kimidat Rabbi Yoshua to be an entarte. You do need two, okay? But, right, the meat and the blood. But, lo kimidat Rabbi Yoshua, de'ilu Rabbi Yoshua bezvachim amar benachot lo amar. Filu hai tana savar afilu b'menachot. What are they saying? The logic of the Tana here is like Rabbi Yeshua, but he takes it even farther than Rabbi Yeshua. So Rabbi Yeshua only said it by zvachim, by sacrifices. And this Tana applied it to menachot, to which the Gemara says, no. Number one, manu haitana dekai kavateu machmir tfemine. You're going to have a Tana that holds like Rabbi Yeshua and be even more machmir. Remember, the Gemara was saying even nobody holds this way, only this one person, Rabbi Yeshua. And now we're going to take his opinion and take it even farther and say he's more machmir than him? That seems weird. And furthermore, Tanya, it says in a Braita, Amar Rabbi Yossi, Ro'ani et divrei Rabbi Eliezer b'menachot u'bizvachim, v'divrei Rabbi Yoshua b'zvachim u'menachot. I'll tell you already, this Braita makes no sense. We're going to get to it in the next stuff, what this Braita means. But right now we're going to read it without really understanding it, but take out what we need for our purposes, which is, Rabbi Yossi says, I agree with, and I see his opinion, Rabbi Eliezer opinion, in menachot and in zvachim. And then he says, and I see Rabbi Yeshua's opinion in zvachim and in menachot, which is really one and the same. It's just a different order. Something seems strange here, but the point is, he says, I see Rabbi Yeshua's point when it comes to zvachim and menachot, as if Rabbi Yeshua must hold that way also in menachot, which is different than what we just said. Divrei Rabbi Eliezer b'zvachim shaya omer dam af al pi she'en sham basar. Right? He's just saying now, in what way do I hold like him when it comes to zvachim about this issue of dam, even though there's no meat? Okay, so that's just a repeat of what Rabbi Yeshua's opinion is. What is it in menachot? Again, this is just repeat. Right? You can take the kmitza and burn it on the altar. That's the part that the Kohen sticks his 3 fingers in. He takes a little part of the dough, he burns it on the altar, and the rest are the leftovers, and that they can eat. He said, we don't do the kmitza if we lost the shirayim. We don't do the shirayim. We can't eat them if we lost the komets. So therefore, it can't be this basically, okay, this was a long back and forth to try to come up with an explanation that maybe what Rabbi Yeshua means is as long as you can put things on the altar, that would be, the tzitz is meratza on those, to which we said, that doesn't help you with the menachot in our Mishnah, so therefore we're stuck. Because Rabbi Yeshua says also by menachot, there's nothing that goes on the altar, and im ein dam, ein basar, ein dam, and then we're stuck again. If you say tuma dechuya, then you're going to need the tzitz to be maratza. The tzitz will be maratza on these sacrifices, but it won't be maratza on the part that we eat, and then you're going to be stuck with the omer and shtei lechem, and if you can't eat it, then you shouldn't be allowed to bring the sacrifice at all, and yet the Mishnah says it is, so our Mishnah wouldn't fit with Rabbi Yeshua. So answer number 2. That was all answer number 1, to say that maybe he says the tzitz is maratza on the olim, the things that go on the altar, and maybe that will resolve it, but it didn't. Answer number 2. Ela kasavar Rabbi Yeshua. Hatzitz meratzeh al ha'olim va'al ha'achilot. Maybe the tzitz, according to Rabbi Yeshua, is meratzeh not only on things that go on the altar, but also that, and also on food. Maybe it is meratzeh food, which would then resolve our issue with the shtel lechem and the omer. But what's the problem? Well, that source we just saw before said explicitly no. What did it say? Remember that braita? Amai kimidat Rabbi Yeshua psula. It said, if you lose the shirayim, right? It was a few lines up. Nitmeu shiareha avdu shiareha, or nisrafu also. Kimidat Rabbi Yeshua psula. If you lose the shirayim, then you can't bring the mincha. So he says it explicitly, it doesn't work. So what did they say? Maybe that line, Kimidat Rabbi Yeshua psula, is only avud v'saruf. Ela nitma. Okay, so now, there's 3 things in there. Nitma, it got impure, which is the one for our purposes, because the whole thing is, if the tzitz is meratzeh, does it allow you to do the rest, right? And this comes to saying, no, it doesn't. So that's one. Avud v'saruf are 2 other cases, if it gets lost or it gets burnt. Now, maybe Rabbi Yeshua is saying in that case it's pasul, because imein basal, ein dam, ein basal, but there's no tzitz. The tzitz is only atones for tumah issues. So when it comes to tumah, the tzitz maybe will be meratzeh and allow you to eat the shirayim. And therefore, Rabbi Yeshua, when he's postel, isn't talking about the case of tumah. What's the problem with saying that? Hela nitma leman katami. But who says nitma? Then the nitma case, what's it doing in the Mishnah? Must be coming for Rabbi Eliezer then, but that doesn't make sense either. The Rabbi Eliezer pshita. Obviously, Rabbi Eliezer is going to say for Rabbi Eliezer, why? Hashi yeshlomer avu v'saruf delitnehu machshir Rabbi Eliezer nitma di'itim mebaya. When it comes to the shirayim get lost or burnt, and Rabbi Eliezer says, we don't care, you could still burn the kmitza on the altar. Well, you're going to now say, what if it's impure and it's in front of us? Of course we're going to allow you to burn the kmitza. It's much worse when it's totally not here anymore at all. So therefore, there's no reason to say that line, the nitma, is there for Rabbi Eliezer, which means we're back to saying it's there for Rabbi Yeshua, l'pshita l'Rabbi Yeshua, v'katani psula, and therefore it doesn't make any sense to say, based on that source, that Mishnah, that Rabbi Yeshua would allow, that he would think that tzitz is meratzeh also on eating, which would include the shirayim and the shtei halechem. And furthermore, we're going to have another question. V'od tanya Rabbi Yeshua omer, it says in a braita that Rabbi Yeshua says, kol zvachim shebetorah, בין שנטמע בשר וחלב קיים, ובין שנטמע חלב ובשר קיים, זורק את הדם. Okay, here's a different thing. We're talking about now the meat that gets eaten and the chalev that gets burned. So all sacrifices, whether it's the basar became impure, but you still have the chalev, or the chalev becoming pure and you still have the basar, Rabbi Yeshua will say, right, you can be zorek et hadam, because you at least have one of them, right? This is ein dam, ein basar, but at least you have either the basar or the chalev. But if both become burnt, impure, then you can't. So now, what do you see from here? He basically says that tzitz obviously doesn't permit this, because if both of them became tamei, and you have nothing left, then you can't sprinkle the blood. Why can't you sprinkle the blood? Because the tzitz is not going to be meratzeh on the food or on the stuff you burn on the altar, which again shows that. And because he holds in ein basal, ein dam, there's no can do. You can't sprinkle the blood. So clearly he holds that tzitz is not meratzeh, not on food and not on things that go on the altar. So the first answer was to try to say, maybe the Mishnah matches him and he thinks the tzitz is meratzeh on things that go on the altar. We rejected that because it didn't resolve our issue with the omer and the shtei halechem. So then we said, maybe he means that tzitz is meratzeh even on food, and that would include those two. But we just proved there's no way Rabbi Yeshua says that. So third answer, Elol Rabbi Yeshua matnitin. Our Mishnah does match Rabbi Yeshua. So how do you explain it with that, particularly with the Mishnah that says that Rabbi Yeshua is posel, k'midat Rabbi Yeshua psula, right? If the nitmu shi'areh, avdu shi'areh, how are we going to explain that? In nitmu specifically. Below kashya kam chatchila kan diavad. Let's say our Mishnah is b'diavad. If you did it anyway, it's fine. And that braita says it's psula, that's lechatchila. You shouldn't do it lechatchila, okay? If you know that that's the situation, so don't sacrifice it, okay? Right? You lost the shirayim, don't burn the kmitza on the altar. It became impure, don't burn it. But our Mishnah is saying, if it happened and you did it anyway, then it's okay. Well, there's going to be a bit of a problem here, right? So ki amar Rabbi Yeshua lechatchila di'eved lo, right? When he said it, he meant it lechatchila, but not b'di'eved, when he said it in that other Mishnah. So first they say, Menat Tamer Deshanelan Leila Rabbi Yoshua ben lechatchila ben di'avad. First they're going to say, where do we know this from, that he can make this distinction? So they prove it from a Braita. Ditanya. Nitma basal, o shenifsal, o she'yasa chutz leklaim. Let's say the meat became impure, or it became disqualified, or you took it out of the azara where it's not supposed to go. Rabbi Eliezer Omer yizarek. He said you can sprinkle the blood. Rabbi Yoshua Omer lo yizarek. You can't sprinkle the blood. Umode Rabbi Yoshua shim zarak hirtza urtza. There you have it. The Braita says, he says b'diavad it's okay. So that's to explain the seeming contradiction between the Mishnah, if we hold according to Rabbi Yoshua, and the other Mishnah that we quoted before about Kimidat Rabbi Yoshua Psula, about the Shirayim. But the Gemara is going to reject this too. Why? Chada di psula di eved mashma. When it says psula, psula means it's disqualified. That means even b'di'eved, if it's already done, it's disqualified. That doesn't mean don't do it lechatchila, right? But if it happened, it's okay. So that's number one, ve'od. And not only that, you want to say our Mishnah is b'di'eved. That doesn't make sense either, because look at the language. Chamisha dvarim ba'im b'tum'ah. Lechatchila mashma. It says these 5 things can be brought b'tum'ah. It sounds like even if you know they're tamei, you can bring them. It doesn't sound like a b'di'eved situation. So I'll just finish one more line, because we'll finish up this topic. Ela lo kashya, kam b'yachid, kam b'tzibur. So the 4th answer is we can still explain the Mishnah's Rabbi Yoshua. And how are we going to explain it? Kam b'yachid, kam b'tzibur. When it comes to our Mishnah, was talking about tzibur. The Mishnah that talked about nitma'u shi'areh was talking about a regular mincha, not necessarily the mincha to Omer. There, we could say it was talking about a mincha of an individual. When it comes to an individual, we're not going to allow things. But when we have something communal, we're going to be more lenient about it. So maybe Rabbi Yoshua, and this was a very easy answer, would have saved us a lot of back and forth and complicated. This wasn't an easy sugya. In the end, we have a very easy answer, which is our Mishnah is talking about communal offerings. There, Rabbi Yeshua is going to be more lenient and allow it, whereas the Mishnah about menachot is talking about individual. And there, he's going to say it's disqualified if you don't have the shirayim. But here, again, where do we get to? Here, our Mishnah works because even though tuma dichuya, meaning it's not permitted entirely, it's still there. The tzitz is miratzeh. According to Rabbi Yeshua, the tzitz is not miratzeh on food or on things that go on the altar, which means that we're going to have a case where we can sprinkle the blood, but we don't have the meat. The meat's no good. So how does Rabbi Yeshua allow that? If he basically says, im ein basar ein dam, he allows it for communal offerings. And that's the end of our sugya. Okay, like I said, this was quite complicated. Hopefully you got it. It's organized here on the sheets. That can help you understand the back and forth and what's going on here. And with that, we will start tomorrow with another question. Oh, Nema Manitin Deloka Rabbi Yossi. Should we say our Mishnah is not like Rabbi Yossi? And then we're going to go into Rabbi Yossi. With that, we will finish. Have a Shabbat Shalom or Shavua Tov.